We've had tenets in our Army and our doctrine for a very long time, going back to 1982. Depth has been with us the entire time because of that idea of that extended battlefield. And we think about multi-domain operations and the range constraints or lack of range constraints for things like space and cyberspace. Depth remains absolutely as important as it always has been. We work our way up from the bottom. We talk about endurance. You talk about endurance because you need endurance to reach the kind of depths that you need to achieve the objectives or defeat enemy forces during conflict. Endurance is also closely related to the sustainment warfighting function. And so when we think about endurance, we think about a lot of different factors. We think about the impact of operations on units and leaders, units and soldiers. We think about sustainment in terms of how much op-tempo do we have generated into the plans. And so when we think about tenets, we really want to think about the way we measure ourselves in terms of course of action development, right? And so when you do a decision matrix, as we're comparing courses of action, you can use the tenets as a way to say, hey, does this operation reflect the degree of agility, convergence, endurance, and depth that we're looking for? And then if not, then what do we need to do that to achieve the objectives that we've been assigned? Working our way up to agility, I'm saving convergence for last because that's kind of a new idea. When we think about agility, your point of departure needs to think about how Army forces actually operate. We're formations of people and equipment that move over land. And land terrain is not the same as flying an airplane or sailing a ship, right? You can't just turn a wheel and have the whole thing move. And so the components of agility start with training and leader development. They start with SOPs. They start with an understanding of your own doctrine. And then the repetitions necessary to be able to move more quickly relative to the threat. But there's other aspects of agility, right? How fast do we make decisions? How fast can we collect information that inform those decisions? How fast can we move? Obviously, that's one part. But also things like how fast can we task organize and retask organize forces across different phases of an operation. So there's a lot of components to that. And then lastly, convergence, and that's one of the tenets from the 2018 MDO concept, and we define it as an outcome. And convergence is really the business of corps and to a lesser extent divisions, because large-scale combat operations are an echelon above brigade fight. And so when we talk about an outcome and we talk about the concerted employment of all available capabilities, it drives us back into that discussion we just had about combined arms, right? And we've extended the idea of combined arms to include those joint capabilities. And we do that with the understanding that we're remembering that land is still a domain, right? So when you hear multi-domain operations, the first thing people want to think about is offensive cyber operations or the employment of space capabilities. And that's important, right? And that is what's new compared to the past to the degree that those capabilities can have an impact on lower tactical formations. But it's those echelons above brigade that have access and the authorities to employ those capabilities, which are inherently scarce, right? And so the authorities necessary to employ those generally are going to reside at the higher echelons. Corps and divisions try to establish convergence to create conditions that are exploitable by the lower echelons, right? And you can think about it in terms of that old 19th century idea of centers of gravity, right? In the modern world, in that systems warfare approach, two opposing forces are complex, adaptable systems, right? And because they're complex, adaptable systems, there's no one single center of gravity. They have multiple centers of gravity, if you would. And we want to attack those either sequentially or simultaneously in ways that allow us to defeat that threat in detail. Convergence helps us do that. So if tenets really apply to how we want to plan and organize ourselves for the conduct of operations and then employ combat power that way, imperatives really get to the how, right? Those things that you must do if you want to win at acceptable cost. And they're really applicable to every echelon, from individual soldiers all the way up to theater armies or land component commands. And they should be informing how we conduct training and leader development between now and 2030. The first is linked to that description of the operational environment I talked about earlier. We got to see ourselves. We got to understand blue. We got to understand red. We got to understand the interaction between blue and red in any particular assigned area at any particular echelon. What can the threat do to us? What can we do to the threat? And what are the other factors in the operational environment around us that may serve as a constraint for the employment of those capabilities? The second one is hugely important, and we could spend a very long time talking about what it means to account for being under constant observation. Right, operations in Ukraine since February have made it very clear that the battlefield is increasingly transparent, if not absolutely so. Right, so how do we account for that? So friendly forces were always under observation in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? They knew where the FOBs were. They kept track of us as we went on and off to conduct patrols and so forth. But they couldn't do much about it, could they? Never were we really at risk of having a FOB destroyed. When you talk about large-scale combat operations, a FOB is just a big target, right? And it's very vulnerable. So we can't operate that way. That drives us towards thinking in terms of dispersion, the management of our electromagnetic spectrum footprint, things like operations security, right? Noise and light discipline, camouflage, concealment, the employment of obscuration, tactical deception, military deception at the joint level. All of those things really drive us towards a different cultural approach to the operations we conduct. We do movements during periods of limited visibility, for example. We spread out our march serials during our approach marches to a tactical assembly area or out of a tactical assembly area and so forth. The third bullet there gets to what we talked about in terms of the different forms of advantage. Decision dominance is inherently aspirational. We don't know whether we have decision dominance until the after-action review or the history of a campaign is written. But what we do know is that we need to constantly strive for all three forms of advantage and then exploit those forms of advantage whenever possible. The next bullet talks about making contact with the smallest element possible. So we've had to worry about doing those kinds of things, at least in the maneuver world, for a very long time. In the 21st century, what's different is we have unmanned systems, and what we say in the doctrine is that when at all possible, you want to make contact with unmanned systems first, with your robotics, with your UAS, right? And there's capabilities coming into the Army that will increase our ability to do that. But there's real implications in terms of training and leader development when you talk about simple tactical ideas like moving techniques, right? Bounding overwatch. What does bounding overwatch look like for a battalion task force that now has the ability to use UAS to make that first contact, right? And we've seen what happens when you don't make contact with the smallest force possible or unmanned systems in Ukraine on both sides of the equation, right? Imposing multiple dilemmas, I've talked about that already. But the big idea is don't give the enemy one thing to focus on, right? And we have the ability to do that at every echelon. But the further up we move in our echelons, which is why LSCO, large-scale combat operations, is in echelons above brigade fight, is because the higher the echelon, the more tools that are available to create those dilemmas. And the lower tactical echelons are the execution arm for creating those dilemmas in real time in the real world. Transitions. There's all kinds of transitions. And I should have said this up front, but every one of these bullets has a page or at least multiple paragraphs that describe the different considerations associated with these imperatives. Transitions is one that we get into, all the different types of transitions out there. So when you think about transitions, again, it drives you back to training and leader development. What kind of transitions are we talking about? We're talking about transitions between competition, crisis, and conflict. We're talking about transitions between phases of an operation. We're talking about transitions in terms of task organization. We're talking about transitions in terms of new information, employing that mission command approach, and then deviating from the plan when conditions require us to do that. So transitions, again, it feeds right into that tenet of agility. You need agility if you're going to be able to execute transitions quickly or more effectively than the adversary or enemy. This idea of keeping the main thing, right? Designate, wait, and sustain the main effort. In any given time and place, there should be a single main effort for a formation. It's going to look different for a platoon than it does for a company, perhaps, a company to a brigade to a corps, right? So what is the main effort? In any given time and place, it may not be fighting. It may be sustainment is the main effort as we're trying to build combat power, right? That enabling operation across the wet gap may be the main effort for a division operation in a particular phase. And so keeping the main thing, and making that very clear in terms of priorities of resources and how we task organize ourselves is hugely important. This idea of consolidating gains continuously. Now that's not new in terms of what our doctrine says. In 2017, we said that we want to consolidate gains as continuously as possible. However, because it was the last chapter of the book, it always became the final phase of an operation when people will talk about it. We're doing the consolidation phase, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do. So this time around, we talk about consolidating gains throughout the entire publication in each chapter during the operations that we want to conduct. Right? So to get people to think that in terms of assuming risk, you may be assuming an awful lot of risk if you're going to seize all your objectives and not consolidate gains to prevent the enemy from protracting the conflict using some different form of warfare, for example, transitioning from conventional to irregular warfare. You're accepting more risk, perhaps, if you wait to do that after. Whereas if you consolidate gains as you go along, you plan and resource that, you're probably assuming far less risk in terms of the outcome or the enduring outcomes that you're seeking during that operation that you're conducting. And then lastly, understanding and managing the effects of operations on units and soldiers. So we used to do this a different way as recently as the war in Vietnam, right? In the last 20 years or so, how did we manage the effects of operations on units and leaders? We did it with 9, 12, and 15-month rotations with R&R leave and so forth. We could do that because very seldom were you engaged in sustained land combat for more than a few days at a time, right? So there was time in the battle rhythm to recover from that. In large-scale combat operations, that's not going to be true. In a matter of days, and certainly in a matter of weeks, units become combat ineffective due to the impact of those continuous operations on the units themselves, on the equipment, but most of all on the people. And so even in the war in Ukraine, where both sides have kind of put themselves at the limit, they still rotate units out of the line to rest, reorganize, or reconstitute themselves for future operations. And so we published a book on reconstitution last year, but that's something that we have to take into account as we're planning and designing the operations that we want to conduct.